The hero of this story was someone no one expected. Oleg Gordievsky, deputy head of the KGB residency in London and MI6's most valuable spy. During Able Archer, Gordievsky was reading the messages coming from Moscow, and what he read filled him with horror. The Soviet leadership truly believed it. They truly believed that NATO was about to attack. Nuclear forces had been put on alert. Missiles were being prepared. Gordievsky urgently transmitted this information to his British handlers. They passed it to Washington, and the Reagan administration was shocked. Were the Soviets serious? Had they perceived a military exercise as a real attack? Were we that close? The answer was yes. And without the warning of a single double agent, the world might have ended that week. This is the story of the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. Not during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not during the Berlin blockade. In November 1983, when a routine NATO exercise nearly triggered World War III. To understand how close we came, you must first understand the mindset of the Soviet leadership in 1983. The Soviet Union was dying. Its economy was stagnating. Its technology was falling behind. Its war in Afghanistan was draining resources and morale. The men in the Kremlin knew their system was failing. And then Ronald Reagan became president. Reagan's rhetoric was unlike anything the Soviets had heard from an American leader. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He spoke openly about winning the Cold War, not just containing it. He launched the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. The Soviets watched with growing alarm. New Pershing II missiles were being deployed to Western Europe. These missiles could reach Moscow in just 6 minutes. There would be no time to respond, no time to evacuate, no time for anything except death. Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief who had become Soviet leader, was convinced that America was planning a first strike. He had spent his career studying Western deception operations. He saw patterns everywhere. He trusted no one. In 1981, Andropov launched Operation Ryan. The name was a Russian acronym for nuclear missile attack. Every KGB station in the world received the same order. Find evidence of American attack preparations. Report any signs immediately. The problem with this order was that it created a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you tell intelligence officers to find evidence of an attack, they will find evidence of an attack, whether or not one exists. Oleg Gordievsky had been working for British intelligence since 1974. He was not motivated by money. He was not blackmailed. He was an idealist who had lost faith in the Soviet system. The crushing of the Prague Spring in 1968 had shattered his belief in communism. He saw the KGB as an instrument of oppression, not protection. MI6 recognized his value immediately. Gordievsky was brilliant, well-connected, and positioned at the heart of Soviet intelligence operations in Western Europe. He provided information on KGB methods, Soviet agents, and Kremlin thinking that no other source could match. By 1982, Gordievsky had risen to become deputy resident in London. This meant he received the most sensitive communications from Moscow Center. He knew what the Soviet leadership was thinking, often before they acted on it. In the spring of 1983, Gordievsky noticed something alarming. The tenor of messages from Moscow was changing. They were becoming more urgent, more paranoid, more convinced that war was imminent. Ryan intelligence requirements intensified. KGB officers were ordered to monitor seemingly mundane indicators. Were lights burning late in government buildings? Were blood banks increasing their supplies? Were slaughterhouses working overtime to stockpile meat? The Soviets believed these would be the subtle signs of an imminent nuclear attack. A rational observer would see normal bureaucratic activity. The KGB saw evidence of Armageddon. Gordievsky reported all of this to MI6, but at that point, the British were not sure how seriously to take it. Soviet paranoia was nothing new. Perhaps this was just another phase. Then, Able Archer began. If you want to discover the secret technologies and untold stories of the Cold War, Subscribe to our channel. We bring you new content every week. Able Archer was an annual NATO command post exercise. It simulated the procedures NATO would use to authorize nuclear weapons in the event of a Soviet attack on Western Europe. The 1983 exercise was scheduled to run from November 7th to November 11th. It involved military commanders across Western Europe and North America, practicing the communications and decision-making protocols for nuclear war. On the surface, it seemed routine. NATO had conducted similar exercises for years. The Soviets always monitored them. Nothing unusual ever happened. But the 1983 exercise was different in several important ways. For the first time, the exercise used new, highly realistic communication procedures. The format of the messages closely resembled what actual nuclear authorization communications would look like. To anyone listening in, it would be difficult to distinguish the exercise from reality. The exercise also practiced a new escalation scenario. It began with a conventional Soviet attack on Western Europe and escalated through chemical weapons use to a full nuclear exchange. The simulation was more detailed and more realistic than any previous Able Archer. Most significantly, the exercise involved senior government officials for the first time. Previous exercises had been purely military affairs. This one included participation at the highest levels, simulating actual political decision-making during a nuclear crisis. The Soviets were watching, and what they saw terrified them. Within days of Able Archer beginning, alarming reports began flooding into Moscow. KGB stations across Europe reported unusual activity at American and NATO bases. Aircraft were being moved to different locations. Leave had been canceled for some units. Communications traffic had increased dramatically. To Soviet analysts already primed to see evidence of attack, these reports confirmed their worst fears. This was not an exercise. This was the real thing. NATO was using Able Archer as cover for an actual first strike. The Soviet response was immediate and terrifying. Nuclear-capable aircraft in East Germany and Poland were placed on heightened alert. Pilots were ordered to remain near their aircraft. Weapons were moved from storage facilities to forward positions. In the Soviet Union itself, intercontinental ballistic missile crews were placed on standby. Submarine commanders were given preliminary orders. The entire Soviet nuclear apparatus began preparing for war. Oleg Gordievsky watched this unfold with growing horror. He received urgent telegrams from Moscow describing NATO's nuclear attack preparations. He read assessments that concluded war could begin within days. He saw his own colleagues preparing for the end. The messages were clear. Moscow believed that NATO intended to use Able Archer as the cover story for a genuine nuclear first strike. They believed the exercise would transition seamlessly into real attack. They believed they were about to die, and they were preparing to launch their own missiles before that happened. Gordievsky knew he had to act. The information he was seeing was too important to wait for normal communication channels. He arranged an emergency meeting with his MI6 handlers. In a London safe house, he explained what was happening in Moscow. The Soviet leadership was not bluffing. They were not posturing. They genuinely believed that nuclear war was imminent. The British intelligence officers were stunned. They had never seen Gordievsky so agitated. He insisted that his superiors needed to understand the danger. A miscalculation could trigger a Soviet preemptive strike. Millions would die because of a misunderstanding. MI6 immediately transmitted Gordievsky's warning to the highest levels of the British government. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was briefed personally. She in turn contacted President Reagan. The American reaction was one of disbelief. Reagan had never intended to threaten the Soviet Union with Able Archer. It was just an exercise. How could the Soviets possibly believe it was real? But the intelligence was clear. Soviet nuclear forces were on unprecedented alert. Communications intercepts confirmed that Moscow was treating the exercise as a genuine threat. The danger was real. The decision was made to wind down Able Archer carefully. The exercise would continue, but certain elements would be scaled back. The most realistic and provocative aspects would be toned down. The goal was to avoid any action that might confirm Soviet fears. It worked. As Able Archer ended on November 11th, Soviet alert levels gradually decreased. The crisis passed without most of the world ever knowing how close it had come. The Able Archer crisis had a profound impact on Ronald Reagan. The president had never believed that the Soviets genuinely feared an American attack. He saw his military buildup as defensive, designed to negotiate from a position of strength. The idea that Moscow might interpret his actions as preparation for war had never occurred to him. Gordievsky's intelligence changed his perspective. Reagan began to understand that the Soviet leadership was not a monolithic block of confident aggressors. They were frightened old men, ruling a failing system, convinced that the Americans were coming to destroy them. In his diary, Reagan wrote that the exercise had given him a new appreciation of Soviet fears. He realized that his rhetoric about evil empires and winning the Cold War might have been unintended consequences. He began to seek dialogue rather than confrontation. The following year, Reagan delivered a speech that surprised observers on both sides of the Iron Curtain. He spoke of the need to reduce nuclear weapons, not just limit their growth. He expressed willingness to meet with Soviet leaders. He used language of reconciliation rather than confrontation. This shift would eventually lead to Reagan's meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev and the arms reduction treaties that helped end the Cold War peacefully. Historians credit Able Archer as a turning point, the moment when Reagan realized that his aggressive approach might actually trigger the war he was trying to prevent. Gordievsky continued to spy for another 2 years. In 1985, he was recalled to Moscow under suspicion. MI6 conducted a daring exfiltration operation, smuggling him out of the Soviet Union in the trunk of a diplomatic car. He has lived in Britain ever since. What made Able Archer even more dangerous was that it came just weeks after another near catastrophe. On September 26, 1983, Soviet early warning satellites detected the launch of 5 American Minuteman missiles. The computer systems showed the missiles climbing out of their silos and heading toward the Soviet Union. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer that night. His orders were explicit. If the early warning system detected an American launch, he was to immediately notify his superiors so that Soviet missiles could be launched in retaliation. There would be only minutes to respond. Petrov looked at the screen. 5 missiles, not 50, not 500, just 5. Something did not make sense. If America was launching a genuine first strike, why would they send only 5 missiles? The whole point of a first strike was to destroy the enemy's ability to retaliate. 5 missiles could not do that. Petrov made a decision that should have been impossible. He reported the alarm as a system malfunction. He did not pass it up the chain of command. He did not trigger the Soviet launch sequence. He was right. The satellites had been fooled by sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds. There were no American missiles. The world had come within minutes of nuclear war because of a glitch. Petrov was initially praised for his judgment. Then he was quietly reprimanded for not following proper procedures. His career stalled. He retired in obscurity. The terrifying truth is that the Soviet command structure came within minutes of ordering a retaliatory strike based on a false alarm. And this happened just 6 weeks before Able Archer pushed tensions even higher. The Able Archer crisis revealed fundamental flaws in how both superpowers understood each other. The Americans had no idea how paranoid the Soviet leadership had become. They assumed that Moscow understood deterrence the same way Washington did. They believed that the Soviets knew an American first strike was unthinkable. They were wrong. The Soviets had no idea that Able Archer was purely an exercise. Their intelligence gathering was focused on finding evidence of attack, not on understanding American intentions. They saw what they expected to see. Confirmation bias nearly destroyed the world. Communication between the superpowers had almost completely broken down. There was no hotline conversation during Able Archer, no diplomatic backchannel to clarify intentions. The two sides were operating in complete isolation, each convinced the other was about to strike. The intelligence agencies on both sides failed catastrophically. The CIA did not anticipate Soviet alarm over the exercise. The KGB convinced itself that routine military activities were evidence of attack preparations. Neither side understood what the other was actually thinking. Most frighteningly, the nuclear command structures on both sides were designed for speed, not verification. The entire system was built to launch weapons within minutes of detecting an attack. There was no time built in for questioning whether the attack was real. Automation and protocol had nearly replaced human judgment. Able Archer demonstrated that nuclear war could start not from intention, but from misunderstanding. Not from aggression, but from fear. The weapons were designed to be used quickly. The systems were designed to prevent hesitation. And hesitation was the only thing that could prevent catastrophe. The Able Archer crisis should have transformed how the world thinks about nuclear weapons. For a brief moment, it did. Reagan and Gorbachev negotiated the INF Treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. Strategic arms talks made real progress. The idea of nuclear abolition entered mainstream political discussion for the first time. But as the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, the lessons of Able Archer faded from memory. The world convinced itself that nuclear war had always been impossible, that deterrence had always worked, that we had never really been in danger. This was a comfortable illusion. The truth is that we survived November 1983 largely through luck. Luck that Gordievsky was in London. Luck that MI6 took his warning seriously. Luck that Reagan listened. Luck that Petrov trusted his instincts 6 weeks earlier. The systems that nearly failed in 1983 still exist today. Nuclear weapons remain on hair-trigger alert. Launch protocols still prioritize speed over verification. The potential for misunderstanding and miscalculation has not been eliminated. The world has simply chosen to forget how close we came. We have convinced ourselves that it cannot happen again. But the weapons are still there. The command structures are still there. And human beings, with all their fears and biases and capacity for error, are still in charge. Oleg Gordievsky is now in his 90s, living quietly in England under an assumed name. He has received honors from the British government for his service. Margaret Thatcher personally thanked him. Intelligence professionals on both sides of the Atlantic acknowledge that his warning during Able Archer may have prevented nuclear war. But Gordievsky himself has always been modest about his role. He did what he believed was right. He passed information to people who could act on it. The decisions that prevented catastrophe were made by others. What haunts him is how close it came. The messages he read in November 1983 were not ambiguous. The Soviet leadership was preparing for war. They believed it was coming. They were ready to launch. And almost no one in the West knew. The Able Archer crisis remained classified for decades. When details finally emerged in the 2000s, many historians were shocked. The Cuban Missile Crisis had been thoroughly documented and analyzed. Able Archer had been almost completely unknown. This ignorance itself is dangerous. We cannot learn from crises we do not know occurred. We cannot prevent future catastrophes if we do not understand past ones. Gordievsky's warning saved millions of lives, but it was a warning that should never have been necessary. The systems that brought us to the brink of annihilation were designed by rational people for rational purposes. They nearly destroyed civilization anyway. That is the true lesson of Able Archer. Nuclear weapons do not make us safe. They make us lucky. And luck, by definition, eventually runs out.